Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm so honored to do a second talk. Today I'm going to be talking about horror movies and motherhood and fear and what happens when all of these are colliding together. So this talk is the horror of Black motherhood, navigating fear and family. And I wanted to talk about originally it was like 5 films, but it's like 4 films and then one TV series, kind of slant that in. um, but all of these are stories with Black mothers at the center of the story, and they're all drenched in horror. So along the way, I'm going to introduce some different concepts that I kind of came across in trying to build this. We're going to do like mini case studies across them, and just have a conversation at the end. Change, please. So here's the shape of the talk. First, I wanted to kind of go over a shared vocabulary and just kind of go over some different terms and concepts across different domains. So we all have that shared context. Then I'm going to go into the actual case studies of the films and the one series. And then kind of interspersed throughout, I'm going to do some breakdowns that look at like the systemic things that are going on with those stories. And then at the end, just opening it up to have a conversation if there's any questions or anything like that. So let's go forth. Change, please. So the central question here, this is what I want everyone to kind of think about when it comes to this topic. What happens when the monster isn't the only thing to fear? So in every film in our list, all of the case studies that we're going to go over, Black mothers are actually dealing with 2 threats that are running at the same time. There's genre horror, the ghost, the demon, the exorcism, and all of that stuff. And then there's systemic horror. So there's the racism, poverty, medical neglect and discrimination, state surveillance, policing, generational trauma, at the same time. And so these films are all showing how these things are not separate, but they're colliding together. Change. So again, these are like the 2 layers of fear that we're going to be talking about with these specific examples of horror. So again, the genre horror, that's kind of what we know when we think about horror. It's the big scary monster, it's that demon in the closet, it's the haunting of the house, that kind of thing. And like my last talk, actually, the second one is leaning towards something a little bit more different. So it's the systemic horror, the daily machinery that drives racism and poverty and all these systemic issues, that's just already there if you're Black in America. That's what I can talk about at least, but people of color around the world experience discrimination. So this is specifically about Black women and Black mothers. And so change. When we go into what it means to be a Black mom, a Black mother, we have some foundational things that tell us that it's already a risk, just in and of itself. Because there's some very real facts here when it comes to like the Black maternal death rate. So in 2023, in the US, Black women died of pregnancy-related causes at a rate of 50.3 per 100,000 live births. And that's coming from CDC data. And so that's about roughly 3.5 times higher than white women, for example. And that gap even holds when researchers are applying things and controlling for income and education, which rules out poverty alone as the explanation for this. And so why does this happen? Well, one explanation that we can point towards comes from the research of Arlene Geronimus. She proposed something called the weathering hypothesis back in 1992. Thank you for sharing that as well. Her argument is that chronic exposure to racism and economic stress physically ages the body faster and produces worse health outcomes over time, independent of individual behavior or access to care. So in other words, the stress of navigating a racist society takes a measurable physical toll, and that toll compounds over a lifetime. And on top of that, another potential foundation of that, well, we'll kind of get into that a little bit later. But change, please. Yes. So the second piece is medical racism. So this is describing a systemic bias within healthcare that produces a worse treatment and worse outcomes for Black patients. This is often rooted in really old false beliefs about biological differences between races. So it doesn't have like one single person who kind of coined this really, but it's been documented extensively and thoroughly. And there's a book that Harriet Washington did in 2006 that's called Medical Apartheid that talks a lot about major cases involved in this. But anyways, a more recent study in 2016 shows that, this comes from Kelly Hoffman's work, that when they were surveying white medical students and residents, they found that half of them endorsed the idea that they endorsed at least one false belief of like biological differences between people. For example, claims like Black skin is thicker than white skin. And what's important about that is those same people who held those false beliefs, these doctors and residents and medical students, they rated a Black patient's pain as lower than a white patient's pain for that exact same condition. So that means they're giving less accurate treatment recommendations. They're not believing pain. So this is like all of the medical and discriminatory background that's kind of underpinning why this Black maternal death rate might be the way it is in America. And some famous examples here are two of the most arguably famous Black women in America. There's Serena Williams and Beyonce. So Serena Williams, 23 Grand Slams to her name. She's like a $400 million wealth. And she almost died giving birth in 2017. She actually noticed the symptoms of having some blood clots in her lungs. And when she kept reporting it to her care team, they did not believe her. Serena Williams, they did not believe her. And instead they did an x-ray of her leg. After a lot of pushing, and even her husband's like insistence, they finally listened to her and they found several blood clots in her lungs. So she was able to be saved, but by that point it had gone on for so long, she had to have some follow-up care from that and etc. So she almost didn't make it because of this. And then Beyonce, she also had preeclampsia after she gave birth. And while she didn't have the same story of not being believed right away, this is just an example to show that it can happen to anyone. It doesn't matter what your status is. And if you're not believed like Serena was, it doesn't matter if you're Beyonce or not. So thankfully they both made it through, but this is just the background of what it means to be a Black mother in America. And so when it comes to applying that to the horror and the case studies we're going to talk about, we'll see how this kind of plays out as well. Change, please. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start with some of the concepts that are going to come up. So this is about, the Gothic and the Southern Gothic. And so Gothic fiction as a genre, you guys are way better at this than I am. This is like a layman's summary. But, as a genre, it's building out that dread. You have a lot of imagery of like the decaying house, like buried family secrets, some inherited trauma that keeps coming back. So you've got all that juicy imagery there. And then the Southern Gothic also takes from this as well, but it has its roots specifically in the American South, where there's still that unresolved legacy of American slavery that's always a part of the haunting, which funnily enough, I also mentioned in my last talk too. And some of the case studies that we're going to talk about specifically touch on these, on the Southern Gothic. Change, please. And then so next, there's like possession and exorcism. Again, I'm sure you guys are all super familiar, but for those watching, this is all about the horror trope where a supernatural force is taking control of a person's body and mind. And then there's like the religious flavoring where you have to do the special ritual to expel the demon outside of them. And the modern template really comes from the film The Exorcist from 1973. So it has a lot of Catholic imagery and stuff like that. But what we're going to look at in one of the case studies, instead of Catholic imagery, it's more like Baptist and Pentecostal religious imagery. So it's interesting to see that in terms of exorcism instead of the typical Catholic one. Next, please. And then the ever famous final girl. So this is a classic term coined by film scholar Carol Clover. So this is the woman that survives until the end. Mostly white and young. But what we're going to be looking at here are final mothers. So they're the ones who, I mean, the stories are all about them. They mostly make it to the end in the stories that I'm sharing. But they're Black moms this time. Change. And then we just have a couple more terms. We're going to go with double consciousness. So this comes from W.E.B. Du Bois, and it's talking about the psychological experience of viewing yourself through two lenses at once. So there's your own self-perception, and then there's the second perception of society that others are imposing upon you. And so specifically as a Black person in America, when you're surveilled even in your own mind by the systems that you live in, we see how this surveillance comes out in some of the stories we're going to talk about as well. Because these mothers are having to read every room, every institution, every experience twice. You know, the first is through the lens of just themselves, and then again as how the world is going to interpret a Black woman's actions as she's protecting her children, as she's fighting back for control. And that doubled vigilance becomes its own exhausting form of dread, lending itself to our like Gothic genre definition earlier, that kind of runs underneath everything else that a supernatural plot might try to do on its own. Change. Okay, and the monstrous feminine. So this one ties a lot with the one that comes in next. But this comes from theorist Barbara Creed. And it's just it's an argument about how horror has this long habit of framing the maternal and the female body itself as a source of horror. From birth, motherhood, reproduction, they're rendered as monstrous instead of nurturing. And you can think of movies where pregnancy itself is a threat. Like there's the scenes in the Alien movies where you know, give birth to these chest bursters, Rosemary's Baby, that kind of thing. But what makes this interesting layered into this talk is that Black maternal bodies are already hyper surveilled and pathologized in real life, like we just talked about with the maternal mortality rates. So there's a long story as well when it comes to assumptions about fitness and unfitness to be mothers with Black women that ties really well with this this concept too. And so these films are also touching on the monstrous feminine as a trope, and they're trying to push back against it, even though they're leaning into it to kind of do that. But I think the insistence is that the mother's body will remains a site of survival rather than just a site of horror. And then, oh my goodness, I should have did these better. Change, please. We've got two more concepts to go over before we get into the case studies. So there's the mother wound. This comes from Bethany Webster, and this is talking about the pain passed down through generations of women, where when a mother herself is unhealed and cannot fully offer the attunement that a daughter needs. And so the relationship with their own mothers is a theme that comes up, as we'll see with some of the women here, and it influences how they mother in return. Change. And then lastly, the internalized racism and biracial identity. So kind of like the doubleness that we talked about with W.E.B. Du Bois, what this is doing, coming from psychologist W.S. Carlos Poston, this is talking about how internalized racism can describe the process by which a person is absorbing these negative societal messages about their own racial group and how they turn these messages inward against themselves. And specifically, there's a layer for those with biracial identity that adds a specific layer when you're mixed, where you feel pressure to choose a single identity, or shame or disloyalty, depending on who you choose or don't choose. And the reason I came up is because, yes, some of the women are experiencing this in these stories and how it all layers in. So that's all of the vocabulary of the concepts and stuff that are going to come up. So there's a little bit of context there. And we're going to go into the first case study, Change. So this is one of my favorite films. This is Beloved. So it's based on a novel by Toni Morrison, and it became a movie shortly after. So this is from 1998, directed by Jonathan Demme. Okay, I didn't think about this ahead of time, but this lecture will contain spoilers. So if you haven't seen this movie, or if you're interested, maybe just plug your ears. But it will contain spoilers. Most of these are kind of they've been out for a little bit, so you had some time. Okay. So with Beloved, the premise here is that Sifa is a formerly enslaved woman. She's literally haunted. So the ghost of an infant daughter that she killed, rather than let her be recaptured into slavery, returns to her home, first as a poltergeist, but then she eventually comes back in human form. And so this touches upon one of Toni Morrison's key concepts of rememory. It's a term for trauma that returns as a lived experience rather than just a memory, as though the past is existing in the same physical place of the present. And so, change, please. So the deeper lens on this is we have the Southern Gothic, right? This is still set in a time that's still fresh from the transatlantic slave trade and its effects in America. And our protagonist, Sitha, she's living with her living daughter in a decaying home. Now, the classic Gothic convention of hidden family secrets inside a decaying home is like plain to see here. But what that secret is actually a mother's love that became so extreme that it reads to everyone else as violence. And this story is actually based in some truth. There was an enslaved woman from Kentucky named Margaret Garner, who in 1856, she killed her own daughter rather than let her be returned to slavery under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And some more background to that is that in like the 1600s in Virginia, there was a law called Partus Sequitur Ventrum, which meant that the child's status as enslaved or free came from the mother's status. So if the mother wasn't free, her child wasn't free. And so this basically wrote Black motherhood doctrine directly into the machinery of slavery itself. Sociologist Roshelle Paterson later gave this condition a name. It's called a social death, where slavery is a permanent and violent domination that strips a person of their legal personhood entirely. And so in this movie, Sitha made a choice to try to save her daughter from what she had to live through. And by doing so, the horror of that action comes across the rest of the film. It's just a consequence of all of that. So, change, please. The next film is more recent. This is Never Let Go. This came from 2024. Spoilers up ahead. So the premise is that a mother and her twin sons, they're living in total isolation in the woods. I think they're in Appalachia, but they're tethered to their house by ropes. And it's supposed to be protection from an unnamed evil that only the mom can see. When one of her sons starts to doubt her, the whole family survival system starts to unravel. And so the themes here are protection and control. The film keeps audiences genuinely unsure of whether the mom is actually protecting them or if she's the danger to her own family. And belief itself is kind of the mechanism of horror in this film. change. And so Halle Berry plays Mama, and so she's occupying this really tenuous role as a protector, um, because the film kind of keeps swapping if we should actually believe her, if she is protecting, is she the danger, what's going on? We don't really know. The evil is always unseen, it's off, it's just out of frame, so we don't really know. Is it her grip on reality that's unraveling, or is it real? And then the rope imagery that they have to hold when they want to leave their home. It also kind of is like an umbilical cord, right? They're super tethered to each other. And so now this is just me speculating because the film never actually does this. But personally, I think there's also a lot to be said symbolically about mental health and mental illnesses here. Um, I'm I like, again, the film doesn't state this, but if there's something more serious going on, like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder with Halle Berry's character, we don't know. But it is helpful to know systemically that access to mental health care in this country is really unequal, especially when it comes to your race. And so roughly 1 in 4 Black Americans are seeking treatment when they need it, compared to about 2 in 5 white Americans. So that gap comes down mostly to cost and to stigma around even admitting that you need help in the first place. Um, and so, in this incredibly isolated world that she is in with her children, I'm not saying that it's mental illness and mental health at work here, but if it were, it's highly unlikely she would get the help that she needs because of some of those statistics and just how rural and isolated she is right now. Um, and then change, please. And then we have The Deliverance. So this also comes from 2024. It's on Netflix. And the premise here is we have a single mother who's in recovery from addiction, who moves her family into a new home for a fresh start. Strange occurrences escalate until her children appear possessed. And at the same time, Child Protective Services is closing in on her from the outside at the exact same time. And of note, this film is inspired by a real life story. It's called the Ammons family case. But it's two threats again. The film is treating this demonic entity and then the threat of losing her children to the state as like a single continuous fight. They're not two separate plots, but they're all rooted into this Black Pentecostal faith tradition that is throughout the film as well. Change. So we have possession appearing here. So a very well-loved trope. But as I mentioned earlier, uniquely, it's centered from like a Black Pentecostal tradition versus a Catholic one. There's still a really epic exorcism scene that happens here, but it was like one of the first times I'd ever seen something like from what I grew up around in a film like this. So that was really cool to see. Um, and what's interesting, the distinct difference, I think, is that the possession narrative changes when it's done through the Pentecostal lens because it feels more like um, a tool that a family and church can handle together, not necessarily from an authority imposed from an outside institution like the larger Catholic Church in that sense. But what's systemic about this is, yes, there's a demon, there's something possessing and stalking her family, but on top of that, Ebony is fighting with CPS. They're trying to, they're investigating her, and there's a threat of her losing her children because of her addiction problems. Um, and I mean, this is something that's real in real life. I mean, in 2022, there was this legal scholar, Dorothy Roberts. She made a book talking about, I think it's called Torn Apart. And she was talking about how the child welfare system actually operates as like a family policing system that investigates and removes Black children from families at rates higher than any others. And so while this is happening on one layer, the other layer, the reason why she went into addiction and she has all these problems and she's about to lose her kids and she had to move to this place is because she has some inherited trauma and some unresolved trauma from sexual violence with her own mother. And then when you dig deeper into that, you see Glenna Close is in this movie. Glenna Close plays her mother. This is a young woman with biracial identity. And on top of that, as her white mother abused her terribly, and she never got over that. And so there's just so much balls of trauma wrapped up in this when it comes to navigating a system as biracial and as mixed, and then turning to addiction to try to help with the trauma that she experienced, and then, getting involved with CPS and being policed in that way. So it's just a nesting doll of systemic issues here. So again, yeah, this was based on a true story, but of course, like some freedoms were taken with that. But that is The Deliverance Change. And then this is a sneaky one that's not a movie. It's a TV series, but it was too good not to mention it. It's on Amazon Prime. So this is called Them. And I believe it's 2 seasons. So this is going to be about the first season. So the second season is same actress, but it's like a different story. But they're connected. So this first season, this comes from 2021. The story, not the actual story, but the series. So anyways, the premise of this one is about a Black family who relocates to an all-white neighborhood in the 1950s in a fancy Los Angeles suburb during the Great Migration. And I'm going to talk about what that is a little bit later. But they become terrorized simultaneously by a supernatural entity haunting the house that they've moved into, and also by their neighbors with their escalating organized racial violence against them. So this is like the American dream, but haunted, where it has itself become a trap for this family. And the mother, Lucky, she is absorbing trauma from both fronts at once, the supernatural and the social, and there's no distinction between where one starts and where one begins and ends. And she's trying to fight this all on her own. So change. And so when we read into this haunting and we look at the analysis on it, this haunted house convention is the whole neighborhood. The whole neighborhood is haunted in that sense. And everything is in lockstep here, from the demonic presences and just the way that their neighbors are taunting them and trying to get them out of their neighborhood. It's all in lockstep. So the overall sense of dread comes from both of these fronts at once, for the audience. And now systemically, I mentioned this is happening during the Great Migration. So this was a time period where roughly 6 million Black Americans moved out of the rural South between 1916 and 1970. And so families integrating into these white neighborhoods during this period, they faced a lot of resistance, backed by real official policies. Racially restrictive covenants stemmed forth from this. They were written directly into property deeds to try to keep them out and kick them out. The homeowners loan corporations, 1930s color-coded lending maps came about. That was a practice that later got the name of redlining, which is still used to this day. And it rated Black neighborhoods as financial risks, and it cut off access to home loans. And the Supreme Court even ruled that these restrictive covenants were unenforceable. There's a famous case with Shelley versus Kramer in 1948. But the discriminatory lending and organized neighborhood resistance just kept going anyways, informally, for decades after that ruling. And some would say it still happens to this day. Now, in spite of all of that, Lucky and her family, they're determined to stay in their neighborhood. And as they dig their heels in to fight their neighbors, they start getting hit really hard by some terrible, graphic, demonic stuff that's happening. So this one is really a really good watch. I think it's one of the more graphic. It's one of the more graphic things if you do check it out. But again, we have a Black mom at the center of it all, trying to protect her family, care for her family, experiencing racism and other systemic issues on the one hand, and on the other hand, the stereotypical horror that we know and love. Change. And this is the last one. Now, this one comes from 2025. It's way more recent, so definitely spoilers alert here. I really like this one. For fans of the Babadook, I think you would like this one as well. Yes. So the premise here is that you have a widowed, injured mother. She's trying to hold her grieving family together. And they live on this isolated farm. They don't have any family or friends nearby. When a woman in black starts appearing in their yard, drawing closer and closer every single day, repeating just one line, that today's the day. And so the theme in this film is actually grief. It's grief come through in a physical form. And it asks what mothering looks like when the mother herself is barely holding it together. And what happens when depression starts to look like neglect. Change. So here we can also see some about like the mental health and mental illness systemically, and we also see, the weathering effect, like I mentioned, how over time all this can compound. But from one of the other concepts is this monstrous feminine. So rather than making Ramona, that's the name of the mom in this film, rather than making Ramona's body or her maternity monstrous, what becomes the monster instead is her grief and her depression instead. And the horror is coming from her, from inside, her pain, rather than her body itself being wronged. And so systemically, I mean, you've got things like postpartum depression for Black mothers that has rates that are, at least similar to, so that it's not, there's can be some cases where it's a bit higher. But like I was saying, just the mental health access in general, the weathering effect, and the chronic stress from racism itself, it's wearing down the body long before a condition like depression can get recognized or named by a doctor. And then if you add on top of this, she lost her partner, becoming a widow, and that kind of grief altogether. It's just a big, big ball of grief. And I really like this one because you can get into all the different types of grief. And one of my favorite types of grief to tell people about is a complicated grief or disenfranchised grief, where there's bereavement when you're grieving someone who's died, but things like complicated or disenfranchised grief, it could be something. It's like experiencing a loss of some kind, or maybe you don't know the outcome of something and it still pains you. And so this one really delves into different types of grief that a person can live with and how it can affect them. Change. And so altogether, from all of these case studies, we see love, Black mothers, and their love as both a shield and a curse. And in some cases, the knife itself. With some maternal qualities on the left here, we can see how protection can tip into isolation and control, and never let go. Faith, their faith can kind of lead them into vulnerability and being vulnerable to manipulation. And we saw that in the deliverance. Vigilance, which As a mother, you can think, I'm protecting my family, I'm watching out for danger. It can tip into exhaustion and to the point where you're doubting yourself that you should even be this vigilant in the first place, or wondering why you think everyone's against you. Um, that comes up in Them and The Woman in the Yard. And then there's sacrifice. Uh, Again, a mother could see this as the ultimate form of protection for her family and for her children, but it can very easily go into an erasure of the self, or committing a serious, serious act that you could never come back from. And that was Beloved. So all of these films, they allow the Black mothers as a protagonist to kind of be ambiguous between heroes, between heroism, between horror, between love, and between something deformed from that. And I think a larger thing is that love is never simply safe in these films, especially as a Black woman, especially as a Black mother. Change, please. So when the mother is both the hero and the haunted, um, the real question of all of these films kind of changes. It stops being a simple question of, oh, are they just protecting their family from an outside threat, and that justifies what they're doing and thinking and feeling? And it actually becomes a question more of, who gets to survive in the first place? Who gets to be believed? Who gets protected? And who gets to be afraid in the first place? And so every single vocabulary concept that we went over with at the open, it was to set the stage, but I mostly wanted to look at the horror tropes. When we look at the final girl, the monstrous feminine, the gothic house, double consciousness, the mother wound. I don't think any of these were explicitly written with Black women and Black mothers in mind. But as we saw going through these films, it applies. And these films just do a great job, in my opinion, of handing all of these concepts to an actual mother and seeing how it plays out in the story, with the genre bending around her and allowing her to fill the space of the film. And that is the end. Change, please. So now if anybody has any comments, oh, I'm sorry, I thought I had a question slide. So now that it's the end, feel free to ask any questions, or I'd love to read the comments. I saw some interesting ones pop up. And